The Pirate King, Episode 15, The Line. Sam didn't go home that night. He didn't even point the car in that direction when he left. He drove past the turn he normally took without thinking about it, then past the next one, and by the time it registered, he didn't correct it. There wasn't anywhere he needed to be, not right now. And the idea of sitting still inside a space that was supposed to feel normal made something tighten in his gut. So he kept driving. Street after street, turn after turn. The city moved around him in pieces that didn't connect to anything. Familiar buildings blurred into shapes. Intersections became nothing more than pauses. And the rhythm of the traffic lights felt like someone else's system running without him. The radio stayed off. He reached for it once out of habit, fingers brushing the dial, then stopped and pulled his hand back. The silence wasn't helping, but it felt more honest than noise, and right now, he didn't trust anything that tried to smooth things over. Every thought circled the same place, and it didn't matter how far he drove or how many turns he made, it kept coming back. It was tightening each time like it was trying to lock into something solid. Turn him in. Don't turn him in. The words didn't come as sentences anymore. They came as pressure, as weight, as something sitting behind his eyes that wouldn't let him look anywhere else too long. It should have been simple. That was the part that kept catching him. It should have been clear. He had spent his entire life believing that life was clear, that the lines existed for a reason, and that they had held because people respected them. And when they didn't, there were systems in place that corrected it. You didn't cross them. You didn't blur them. That was what made everything work, and that was what made everything predictable. Now the line was still there. He could feel it, almost see it if he tried hard enough. It was something drawn across the middle of his life that hadn't moved even when everything around it had shifted. He just didn't know which side he was standing on anymore. That was the part no one prepared him for. With his cases, his training, the long nights staring at patterns and reports, there was always a right side to stand on. There was always a direction that lined up with everything else. This didn't line up. This cut through it. He slowed as he turned into a parking lot that barely had any light left in it, the overhead lamps casting weak circles that didn't reach far enough to matter. It wasn't a place he recognized, not one he had any reason to be in, but it didn't matter. It was empty, or close enough to it, and that was all he needed. He pulled into a spot near the edge, straightened the wheel out of habit, and shut the engine off. The quiet settled in immediately, heavier than it had been while he was moving, like it had been waiting for him to stop so it could close them properly. For a long moment, he sat there with both hands still up, resting on the steering wheel, fingers curled just enough to hold without gripping. He stared forward at nothing in particular. The windshield framed a stretch of empty asphalt and a line of a shadow that cut across it. And he focused on that because it was easier than focusing on what was inside his own head. His jaw tightened slightly, then released, then tightened again, as if it was trying to find a place to settle and couldn't. Then he reached for his phone. The movement was slow at first, like he was giving himself time to stop. But he didn't. His fingers wrapped around it, pulled it up from the center console, and brought it into view without him fully looking at it yet. The screen lit up with a soft glow that felt too bright in the dark, and for a second, he just held it there, letting it exist without interacting with it. The number was easy to find. It didn't take any searching, didn't require any thought beyond opening the right contact. Internal direct report. HR had given it to him when he first started, and he had put it in just in case something happened at the division. It was meant to be an inside tool, built into the system so that when something crossed the line, it didn't stay hidden. He had never used it. Sam stared at the screen, his thumb hovering just above it, close enough to feel the faint warmth of the display but not touching it. All he had to do was press call. That was it. No long explanation, no drawn-out process required him to justify himself. He would say the name, the Pirate King. The rest would take care of itself. Procedure would do what procedure always did. Clean, efficient, and final. There was a comfort in that, a backup he could count on, a way of letting the system absorb what needed to be handled so he didn't have to carry it alone. His thumb hovered over the screen, then stopped. It didn't pull away right away. It stayed there, suspended in that space between action and hesitation, like it was waiting for something else to decide for it. His father's voice echoed in his head. Not loud, not forceful, just there, steady in a way that felt familiar enough to cut through everything else. Don't do things halfway. The words didn't feel like advice right now. They felt like pressure, like a hand placed firmly on his shoulder holding him in place. Sam let out a slow breath and lowered the phone slightly, his eyes still on the screen even as it dipped out of the center of his vision. He told himself that wasn't what this was, that this wasn't halfway, that this was doing exactly what he was supposed to do, exactly what he had always believed in. But the thought didn't land cleanly. It caught on something, split, and came back at him from both sides. Should he? Shouldn't he? That was the dilemma that sat inside him, eating him. He closed his eyes, not to shut anything out, but because it was the only way to stop the constant shifting for a second. In the dark behind his eyelids, he saw the shop. Not the version of it that existed now, but the real one. The one he had grown up in. The steady rhythm of it, the consistency. The way it had always been there, always functioning, always stable in a way that didn't match the reality of DJ's position. Everything that had been there when it shouldn't have been possible. Everything he had accepted without question because it had never given him a reason to question it. Then the other side of it entered his mind. The cases, the patterns, the data that had started to line up in ways that couldn't be ignored. The people on the other end of what his father had built, even if they didn't know where it came from. Even if they never saw the structure behind it. It was all there too, just as real, just as undeniable. Two things that didn't belong together, sitting in the same space, connected whether he wanted them to be or not. Sam opened his eyes and picked the phone back up, bringing it back into focus as if that alone might settle something. That was his job. The thought came back stronger this time, sharper, like it was trying to cut through everything else and hold. His thumb moved, then stopped again. He said it quietly this time, not to convince himself, but because it felt like it needed to be said out loud to exist properly. My job. The words didn't carry the weight they normally did. They landed flat, incomplete, like something had been removed from them without even noticing when it happened. But something else was there now. Something he hadn't had before. Context. His dad hadn't built it for power. That part felt clear now in a way it hadn't before. Not for control, not for himself, not for anything that fit the categories Sam had always used to understand people who crossed the line. He had built it for him, to give him what he needed growing up as a single parent. The realization didn't come as a sudden revelation. It settled in slowly, piece by piece, filling in the gaps that had been there before until it was something he couldn't push aside. Sam exhaled slowly and lowered the phone again, this time letting his hand drop farther until it rested loosely against his leg. It didn't make it right. That part didn't change. But it made it harder. It made the line blur in a way the logic alone couldn't fix. He dropped the phone onto the passenger seat and leaned back slightly, bringing both hands up to his face and dragging them down slowly. He pressed his palms against his eyes for a second before letting them fall away. The movement was more about buying time than anything else, about giving himself something physical to do while his mind kept circling the same place. For the first time since this started, he admitted it. He didn't know what to do. Across the city, Keller stood in his office, looking over a different kind of report. One that hadn't passed through any official system yet, but had been built with the same precision as if it had. He had the pages laid out in front of him in clean, deliberate order that didn't leave room for interpretation. The overhead light cast a glow across his desk, sharp enough to define every edge without spilling into the corners of the room. He preferred it that way. Preferred environments that stayed within their boundaries, where nothing drifted unless it was meant to. He held the top page between his fingers for a moment before setting it down again, his eyes moving across the structure not to read it, but to confirm what he already knew was there. Sam Jensen. The name sat atop the document in a standard format that didn't call attention to itself, but everything beneath it did. Performance concerns, procedural deviation, unpredictable behavior. Each line was placed where it needed to be, supported by observations that had been gathered carefully. He flipped the page slowly and let his eyes track the progression of events as they aligned in sequence. Timing, documentation, position. Even though he knew it was all false, he made sure it was all there. He confirmed that it was layered in a way that allowed each piece to reinforce the next without drawing attention to the structure underneath. If someone else picked it up, they would see a pattern that made sense. If they looked closer, they would find support for every conclusion the document suggested. Almost time, he said quietly, not because anyone needed to hear it, but because the words felt appropriate to the moment, like acknowledging a point in a process that had been moving toward this outcome for longer than most people would recognize. A knock came at the door, light but precise, and Keller didn't look up immediately. He let it sit for a second, then closed the folder partway and shifted his attention toward the entrance just as the analyst stepped in, stopping in just inside the threshold, as if waiting for confirmation that the space was still controlled. Keller gave a slight nod, the kind that didn't invite conversation, but allowed it to begin. And the analyst moved forward just enough to deliver what he had come to say. Increased movement tied to the same network, he said, his tone steady. Professional, but with a hint of something underneath it that suggested the data had shifted in a way worth noting. Multiple internal disruptions, expanding activity. Keller didn't respond right away. He let the information settle. Not because he needed time to process it, but because he understood the value of silence in moments like this. It created space for the implications to form, without being directed. He reached out and tapped one finger lightly against the edge of the report, aligning it with the corner of his desk. A small adjustment that had nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with control. Scope? He asked, his voice even, his eyes still on the document rather than the analyst. Wider than before, the analyst replied, shifting his weight slightly as he spoke. Not out of discomfort, but out of awareness. More coordinated. It's not isolated activity anymore. Keller's gaze lifted then, just enough to meet the analyst's eyes. And there was a brief moment where the two of them held that connection. The unspoken understanding passing between them without needing to be stated directly. Keller saw the opportunity immediately. He didn't need to calculate it. It was already there, embedded in the way the information had been presented. The more unstable things appeared, the more necessary resolution would seem. And when that resolution came, it would justify everything. Keep tracking, Keller said, his tone shifting just slightly, enough to indicate that the conversation was moving towards its end. No external tags yet. Let it develop. The analyst nodded once, accepting the instruction without question, and stepped back toward the door. There was no hesitation in his movement, no lingering expectation of further direction. He understood the boundaries of his role, and Keller respected that. As the door closed behind him, the room returned to its previous state. Contained, quiet, the edges of moments sealing themselves back into place. Keller looked back down at the report, his fingers resting lightly against the page that held Sam's name. And for a second, he allowed himself to consider the alignment of everything in front of him. Everything was exactly where he needed them to be. Not forced, not pushed beyond what could be supported, but guided into a position that made the next step inevitable. That was the difference between reaction and control. Anyone could respond to a situation as it unfolded. Fewer could shape it so the response became the only logical outcome. He closed the folder fully this time, setting it aside with a precision that suggested finality without declaring it outright. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed but not loose, his attention already moving ahead to what came next. Timing mattered. Not just when to act, but when not to. The delay, the space, the appearance of uncertainty. It all played a role. And somewhere else in the city, that uncertainty was growing exactly the way he needed it to. Downstairs beneath the shop, DJ stood in the center of the operation, watching everything tighten in a way that didn't require explanation. The screens in front of him didn't display anything dramatic at first glance. Data moved the way it always did, patterns forming and shifting in ways that would have looked normal to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. But he knew. He could see the changes in the way the activity clustered. in the way certain nodes held longer than they should have, in the way timelines shortened without warning. The patterns were shifting faster now, becoming harder to control. He leaned forward slightly, one hand resting on the edge of the console, his eyes moving from one display to the next, not searching, but confirming. They were tracking the consistency of the shift rather than any single point within it. Keller was pushing. That part was clear. It showed in the data, in the clustering of activity that suggested pressure being applied from multiple angles. It showed up in the narrowing focus that reduced the margin for error with each cycle, and in the shortening timelines. DJ understood what that meant. If he moved too aggressively, he would expose things. Not everything. The system had been built with layers, with redundancies that protected the core even under pressure. But enough. Enough to create openings that someone like Keller could exploit. Enough to leave traces that didn't belong. Enough to turn something controlled into something reactive. That wasn't an option. But if he didn't move, Keller would close the gap. He straightened slightly, shifting his weight back, his hand sliding off the console as he stepped away from the immediate focus of the screens. The room around him moved in a way it always did. Operators working within their roles, conversations kept low and efficient. Conversations were contained within the boundaries of what needed to be said and nothing more. They didn't look to him for direction in that moment. They didn't need to. The system was still holding. For now. DJ stood there, just outside the middle of it, weighing it. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know which move he should make. The one that would keep the operation hidden, or the one that would protect his son. Back in the parking lot, Sam picked up his phone again. Not with the same intent as before. Not with the clean, direct purpose that had brought it into his hand in the first time. But because leaving it sitting there felt wrong. Like ignoring it meant something he wasn't ready to accept. His fingers closed around it slowly, lifting it from the seat. The screen still dark now, reflecting a faint version of his own face back at him without detail. Just shape in a shadow. He didn't unlock it right away. He just held it there. His thumb resting against the side, not moving, not pressing, as if the decision itself had weight and he could feel it through the glass. The line between right and wrong was still there. That hadn't changed. He could lay out every step that led to the same conclusion he had reached 100 times before in different situations, with different names attached to them. As clear as it had always been, that was what made this worse. If it had blurred completely, if it had disappeared, then maybe there would be something easier about it. Something that allowed him to step away from the structure he had built his life on. But it hadn't. It was still intact. Now suddenly, it ran directly through his own life. He shifted slightly in the seat, leaning back just enough to let his shoulders settle against the rest. His grip on the phone tightening for a second before loosening again. The car felt smaller now. The space closing in around him, not physically, but in a way that held everything still, like it was waiting for him to do something that he couldn't quite bring himself to do. He stared forward again, but his focus didn't land on anything outside. It stayed inside, circling, pressing, returning to the same place no matter how many times he tried to push it somewhere else. No matter what he chose, something was going to break. That part had become clear in a way that didn't leave room for argument. There wasn't a version of this that ended cleanly. There wasn't a path where everything stayed intact, and he walked away from it without losing something that mattered. This wasn't how it worked anymore. Maybe it never had been. He let out a slow sigh, the kind that didn't release anything but felt necessary anyway. Then he finally tapped the screen, bringing it back to life. The glow returned, soft but immediate, and the same number sat there waiting, unchanged, unaffected by the time that had passed since he first pulled it up. Internal direct report. It didn't look any different now than it had then. It didn't carry any of the weight he felt holding it. It was just a function, a path, a process waiting to be used. He stared at it for a moment longer, shook his head, and then locked it. The screen went dark again, cutting off the option without removing it, pushing it just far enough out of his reach that he didn't have to face it directly. He lowered his hand and set the phone back down on the passenger seat, this time with more intention, placing it flat, screen down, as if turning it away might make the decision easier to ignore. His decision wasn't avoided, just delayed. He knew that this wasn't final. It wasn't resolution. It was giving himself time. Time to think. Time to understand. Time to figure out where he stood without forcing himself into a choice that he wasn't ready to make. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms against the steering wheel this time, his head lowering just enough that gaze dropped to the space between his hands. The position wasn't comfortable, but it grounded him in a way that sitting back hadn't. It gave him something solid to press against while everything else stayed unsettled. His job. The words came back again, but they didn't carry the same certainty. They sat there incomplete, like they needed something else to hold them in place. He had always known what that meant. It had been defined clearly, reinforced through training, through experience, through every decision he had made that aligned with it. You follow the line. You enforce the line. You don't become part of what crosses it. Now, he already was. Not by action, but by connection. He shifted again, lifting his head slightly, his eyes moving back toward the windshield without focusing on anything beyond it. The parking lot hadn't changed. The same empty spaces, the same weak light, the same quiet that had settled in when he first stopped. Nothing out there had shifted. Everything that mattered was happening somewhere else. Dad. The word sat differently now. It didn't lose meaning. It gained weight. It carried everything that had come before. Every moment that had built into what he had understood that relationship to be. And now it carried everything he had learned that complicated it beyond anything he had expected. He was lost. He should make a decision. It might not be an easy one, but one that defined where he stood now, whether he liked it or not. He thought about the shop again, about the way it had always felt when he walked in, the consistency of it, the sense that no matter what was happening outside, that space stayed the same. That hadn't been an illusion. That part was actual. But now he figured out that it was designed and maintained with intention that he had never seen until now. The realization didn't make it easier to accept. It made it harder to dismiss. He let his head fall back against the seat and closed his eyes again. Not long this time. Just enough to reset his focus before opening them. The phone stayed where he had set it, but he didn't reach for it this time. The delay wasn't a solution. but it was all he had. And somewhere else in the city, that delay was exactly what Keller was counting on. Sam stayed there longer than he meant to. Time didn't pass in a way he could measure anymore. Not in minutes or anything that could be tracked. Just in the slow settling of everything that he hadn't resolved. It just hung. He didn't check the clock. He didn't reach for the phone again. He just sat next to it, letting the moment exist without trying to force it into something other than it was. Eventually, he straightened slightly, shifting his hands back onto the wheel without turning the engine over. His fingers rested there the same way they had when he first pulled in, but with less certainty behind them now. The position felt familiar. The uncertainty didn't. He stared forward again, not expecting anything to change, not expecting anything outside of the car to give him direction, but still looking as if something might. Nothing did. The line was still there. He could feel it as clearly as ever, running straight through everything he understood, dividing what should be done from what shouldn't. It held steady in a way that didn't care about the complications wrapped around it. That was the part that made it hard to ignore. He thought more. The problem wasn't the line. It was him. Sam let that sit for a moment, not pushing back against it, not trying to correct it into something more comfortable. The thought wasn't an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. The line hadn't moved. His life had. Or maybe it hadn't moved at all, and that was the problem. Maybe he was still standing in the same place he had always had, trying to apply something that no longer fit the reality in front of him. He exhaled slowly, his grip on the wheel tightening just enough to feel it, then easing again as he forced himself to relax. No matter how he framed it, the outcome didn't change. There wasn't a version of this where he stayed exactly who he had been and made it through without something giving away. The idea that he could hold both sides at once, that he could balance them without choosing, felt thinner the longer he sat with it. He couldn't. That part settled in quietly. Not as a realization that hit all at once, but as something that had been there from the beginning and was only now being acknowledged properly. He couldn't hold both sides. He couldn't keep everything intact. That wasn't how this worked. Something was going to shift, and when it did, it would define everything that came after. His job, his father. The two sat opposite each other now. Not abstract, not distant, but immediate, real, and in direct conflict in a way that didn't allow him to separate them anymore. Before, they had existed in different spaces. Now, they occupied the same one, forcing him to see them together, whether he wanted to or not. He leaned forward again, his forehead coming close to the wheel without touching it. His eyes dropped just enough to break the line of sight out of the windshield. The position felt heavier this time, not because anything had changed physically, but because the space he was sitting in had become something else entirely. It wasn't just a parking lot anymore. It was a place where he had stopped long enough to understand what he was actually dealing with. And understanding it didn't make it easier. It made it real. Sam closed his eyes again for a brief moment, then opened them, his gaze lifting just enough to bring the empty lot back into view. The lights hadn't changed. The shadows hadn't shifted. The world outside the car had continued exactly as it always did, unaffected by the decision sitting in front of him. He reached for the keys. The movement was automatic at first, driven by the simple need to do something that moved him out of the space. But it slowed before he turned them. His hand paused, resting there without committing to the motion. Leaving didn't solve anything, but staying here didn't solve it either. He turned the key. The engine came to life with a low, steady sound that filled the car just enough to break the silence that had been sitting on him, not replacing it, but shifting it into something more manageable. He didn't move right away. He let the engine idle, his hands still on the wheel, his eyes forward, as if giving himself one last chance to reconsider, to reach for the phone again, to force a decision that would bring everything back into alignment. He didn't. Instead, he shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the space slowly, the tires rolling over the same asphalt he had stared at for however long he had been there. The exit of the lot came into view, and for a second he hesitated. Not in a way that stopped him, but in a way that acknowledged the moment for what it was. He didn't make a choice. Not yet, but it was movement. He turned onto the street without signaling, not because he forgot, but because there was no one there to see it. The small break in routine felt insignificant compared to everything else that had changed. The city opened up in front of him again. The same streets, the same lights, the same movement that had carried him here in the first place. Nothing looked different, but everything felt like it had. He drove without a destination again, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't aimless anymore. It was directed by something he hadn't defined yet, but could feel forming under the surface. He told himself the delay wasn't avoidance, it was time. Time he was going to need, whether he wanted to or not. Behind him, the parking lot disappeared into the dark. Just another place in a city full of places that didn't matter to anyone else. But for him, it was where the line stopped being simple. And somewhere else in the city, Keller sat in his office with everything aligned exactly the way he needed it. The structure in front of him waiting for the moment it could be put into motion. Beneath the shop, DJ stood in a space built on control that was beginning to feel the edges of something closing in. And between those 2 points, Sam drove forward with a decision still in front of him. Not made, but avoided, the weight of it settling into place in a way that made one thing clear. No matter how long he delayed it, that line wasn't going anywhere. Coming soon. Episode 16. Collapse.